Hot button.
No, his mom's alive. I think his dad's dead.
Yeah, his mom fucked Professor Oak.
Wait, is
Canon? No, it's like a fan theory or something.
There's 500 Pokemon, now I gotta catch 700. Meanwhile, my mom's getting double teamed by Mr. Mime and Professor Oak. See my family in 10 years.
Professor Oak has all this information on the new Pokemon. He just keeps updating the Pokedex
Why do
every
I
time
need to
Ash
catch them?
gets
You already
close.
know everything about them.
Yeah.
Is this the point that you fill your Pokedex? Just quarantine.
All right, with that, we're going to start this thing.
Okay.
All right, 99.99. Everybody remember?
That's when Skyrim came out.
That's
I thought that's when the Twin Towers went down.
No, that was 420.
Oh, okay, sorry.
99.99. A day that will live in consumer history. And no, I'm not talking about the debut of Britney Spears' Baby One More Time at the 1999 MTV Music Video Awards.
Was that award that was won as most jerked off to by old man award?
Yeah, they're
No,
still
that might
doing
have
that
been
award to this
Christina
day.
Aguilera.
The Cash Me Outside Girls 16 stop jerking off to her music videos. You cut that out.
But no, I am talking, of course, about the Dreamcast, the highly anticipated white little home console from 90s gaming juggernaut and old nemesis to Nintendo, Sega.
Why you gotta be white?
They had a black one. I think that was
Yeah.
like the sports
Yeah.
one, which made me sound more racist. And that's
It's almost
And
like
that's
I
how-
dug you a hole. You
That's
didn't
how
get out
button
of it.
everybody.
yeah, you tricked me.
Yeah, I did.
in what can be described by many enthusiasts as both a success and a failure, just how in the world did one of the most sought-after products of the year by such a respectable and historic gaming company suddenly crash and burn into oblivion, thus making a once great giant to stop producing hardware in the competitive space forever? This is the rise and fall today, and Chris is here to tell you the story. I'm Randall Beatrice, here with Austin Blakesley, and our first-time host for today, Chris Anatuano.
This is a nightmare, and I'm not looking forward to it.
Yeah, no, you're ready. We saw your block of text.
Fuck you guys.
Oh, I've been watching a GIF of an octopus for like 20 minutes. Okay, let me switch back to the script.
Why we're doing it?
I don't know.
So this is Hot Button. What's up with the Sega Dreamcast? Why was it so contentious? And how did it fail despite being so beloved by so many people that just can't let go of the fact that Soul Calibur 2 is better than Soul Calibur 1?
You bite your tongue.
Did Soul Calibur 1 have Link in it? I don't think
I
so.
never played Soul Calibur 2 with Link in it because the GameCube is a trash console.
What, did you
Continue,
play the one
Chris.
with Spawn in it on the Xbox?
Yes.
Spawn sucks.
You suck.
Whoa! You better get beat up. Spawn's awesome.
Is he?
First,
Yeah.
yes, the black console's the sports console. Now Spawn
That's what
sucks.
Does he have a handle?
Let me guess, you hate Blade? Black Panther?
I haven't seen Blade in a long time. I actually remember kind of enjoying Blade.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Yeah.
We're not... Stop talking about movies.
You brought it up.
I brought it up.
Well, I started to do this Rise and Fall Dreamcast episode, and then, like, kind of found out that the Dreamcast was kind of just, like, the end of the rope. Like, it was exciting and all, but, like,
Yeah.
the real reason it failed is because Sega just notoriously just fumbled over and over again since they started making consoles, so...
They shot into the space really quickly and then fucked up apparently a bunch of times, and then
Yeah,
That was
about
their
10 or
last-ditch
12
effort.
years, they were just out of the game completely.
yeah. So like I've seen like a lot of research tells about. I guess this is the history of the company itself, where they came from, because it's a really fucking weird story that most people probably are not aware
Yeah,
of.
well, I'm going to go through every kind of console, do a little bit about the release in North America and Japan.
Yeah.
There's a lot of like weird
they're
little
venturing into
stories I
home
found
space.
from releases in Europe and stuff like that, but like most of it focuses around Japan and North America because that's
Okay.
where all the interesting shit happens.
Yeah.
All right, so let's start with a quick little history of the company itself. Sega begins with the founding of Service Games Hawaii
Terrible
in
name.
1945.
Wait a minute. Hold on.
Wait, what are they? 1945.
Is Sega a shortened version of Service Games?
Oh, yeah.
What?
Yeah. So it was founded in 1945. That famous Japanese company we're talking about, it was founded by 3 white guys. Irving Bromberg, his son Martin Jerome Bromberg, and my favorite white name of all time, James L. Humpert.
Wait, it was founded
John
in Hawaii
Sega.
in 1945?
Yeah.
Yes.
Rough time.
Yeah.
For,
Inspired by Pearl Harbor and all?
That's what the Japanese were doing there. Alright. So Irving had already founded a vending machine business and a coin-operated machine business, which just don't even bother Googling coin-operating machine. It's so boring and like just stupid shit like put a coin in and look at a woman moving on a horse or something. Like,
Spin the wheel.
the tech is just the worst at the time.
Yeah, life before 1980 was garbage.
So Humpert and Irving's son naturally brought him in because he had the kind of engineering and
Humpert.
business tech.
Okay.
It's a good name.
So, in 1951, the Gambling Devices Transportation Act banned slot machines on U.S. bases, which I can't believe it took that long to ban
Wait,
slot
did they
machines.
ever lift that, or are slot machines
I
allowed?
think that's still probably a ban. So all those coin-operated
no
machines
fun.
and gambling machines that Service Games were making, they were in trouble. So Service Games Hawaii sent salesman Richard Stewart and engineer mechanic Raymond Lemiere.
I think that's right.
Who cares? These people are probably dead by now anyway. They sent them to Japan to look for more opportunities, and they ended up founding Service Games Japan. Over time, they build up, open up more factories across Asia. They move into Europe, and they become one of the major slot machine companies in the entire world. So they run that gambit for a while. And in May 1960, Service Games splits into 2 entities in Japan.
Right,
This is
you were
kind of like
telling me about
Sega's
this.
history. They keep
Yeah.
just splitting up into different organizations, coming back together, moving apart. One is called Nihon Gorakubusan, or Udamatic or Automatic.
Better
whatever
than I
it's,
could do.
in America. And that was the distribution company. And then Nihon Kikai, I think it's Kikai, Saizo, or Sega Incorporated, as they
Sega.
called it. And like you said earlier, they took the name from some abbreviation of Service Games, SE Service GA Games.
GA
So-
Games.
Udamatic becomes a pretty big company on their own in the 60s. They distribute jukeboxes by a company called Rockola.
That's dope.
Yeah, and I found a story.
We're not that far into this. There's already so many brilliant company names.
Oh, yeah.
Rockola, Udamatic.
Yeah, it's pretty good. And
Yeah. So I just kind of followed a little rabbit hole in Rockola, and I'm glad I did.
Yeah.
So I found this story. Their founder, David Cullen, he was linked to Chicago organized crime. Apparently so much so that he was like indicted on a ton of charges, like racketeering and all the classic kind of
gee,
like
the Lily Knee.
yeah, all that shit. But he also managed to escape a jail sentence by probably some weird mobster shit. And then afterwards, their company manufactured the M1 Garand rifle for the U.S. Army in World War II.
Yeah,
that's the comeback story of a lifetime.
That's literally the rifle that pings.
Yeah, that's like
yeah.
the main gun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ting, and it shoots the hot lead case out.
So
Yeah.
thanks, Chicago mobsters, for that one. So after their stint distributing jukeboxes, they decide to make their own in Japan instead of distributing because they were being made
Is
in
it
the US.
Garand or Garand?
Garand? I think it's Garand. I'm not
Garand?
sure.
I
Yeah.
don't remember.
I've heard it said by 12-year-old
Both
Call of Duty fans different way. So they decided to make their own so they could sell them at lower prices. They
Okay.
asked the sister company, Sega, to manufacture them, and this led to the first Sega
The
product.
Sega jukebox.
The Sega 1000 jukebox.
I want to see if there's a picture of this thing. You keep going, but I want to see it.
Meanwhile, there's former Air Force officer named David Rosen. He's kind of just hanging out across Japan.
Our names are getting less silly now.
And he has a pretty successful business importing coin-operated instant photo booths in Japan.
Ooh, how instant we talking?
Well, I mean, this is like the 60s or 70s, so it's kind of like Polaroid era.
Okay.
He decides to import electromechanical arcade games, which, if you don't know what they are, they're kind of like your classic, like, bubble hockey, or like it's kind of not really.
It's a combination of kind of like digital and analog technology. Isn't
Yeah,
it?
it's like a weird combination. Like it's not quite arcade games as we know them yet, but also it's not. Oh my god, pinball! I couldn't think of what pinball was called. It's also not pinball. Like it's a little bit more.
Look at this thing. It looks like a newspaper stand on an old person's
looks like a
walking
cigarette
thing.
machine.
It does look like a cigarette machine. Oh man, that's great. I want a Sega 1000 in my house.
We gotta find one. I'm sure they're expensive.
Yeah.
So eventually he makes his own with the help of engineer Hisashi Suzuki, who ends up being in Sega almost up until the first like actual video game console.
Oh,
So
really?
That was pretty cool. Yeah,
Okay.
he helped engineer a lot of stuff. So they make their own. Udomatic buys Sega, so they go back to being one company again, and then they merge with Rosen Enterprises.
Gonna need like some red colored yarn.
Hold on.
Yeah.
Side note, I think Hisashi Suzuki, did you say? I think he went on to help form Square.
Really?
Wait, really?
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty. Yeah, I'm not
Man.
sure. I just looked up that he was just stayed at Sega for a while, and he kind
I'm pretty sure he left Sega in the arcade days and then went on to form Square.
That's
Because
awesome.
that name sounded familiar to me.
That's pretty good.
So basically, David Rosen of Rosen Enterprises merges with the two companies, Sega and Udomatic, and they create Sega Enterprise Limited. And a year later, they released the electromechanical arcade game Periscope. So if you look this up, it's like weird, like you have literally like a submarine periscope and there's like fake water in the box and you like shoot like LED light like like things at like enemy submarines. It is absolutely entertainment for like
pretty
the
good.
era of stickball in the street. Like it seems, it's just like it's so dumb. But this is a massive hit, and apparently I looked up it's credited with reviving the dying arcade scene in America.
That's
like,
insane. That's
just people for hours would sit around shooting LED lights
it's-
at big submarines.
Man, what else are you gonna do?
That success.
Besides get drafted and go to Vietnam or whatever.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. So they continue to innovate electromechanical arcade games, and eventually they're purchased by some big media conglomerate called Gulf Western in 1969. So they keep Sega Enterprises Limited in Japan, and the Sega that's bought by Gulf Western stays in America. Pong becomes a huge game in the 70s.
Pong,
which is,
Pong.
Yeah.
What's that
which
one
is
about?
almost as stupid and boring as the Periscope game.
I'm a defender of Pong. Except the arcade cabinets or Pongs are bullshit because it was on the wheel ball. That game's like ridiculously hard, and the paddles were so small. Like the way that we envision Pong is like later when it was on home consoles when they made the paddles longer and it was on like joysticks.
Jesus.
That was the real Pong.
So the American branch pairs up with the North American company called Gremlin Industries, and they make a bunch of garbage 70s video games like Pong and other weird things. None of them are worth looking up. But they do make a
Yeah,
name for
Pong is
themselves
not-
later on in the early 80s with Turbo.
Turbo. Now Turbo is one I've absolutely
Yeah, so it came out in 1981. It's a third-person Formula One racing game. And apparently it had incredible color that people's minds were blown about, and sprite scaling, which I don't know the exact technical details. I don't know if you do, Austin, but I know it makes it gives the perspective that the car is actually moving forward. Like most of the games are like
Is that like moving the other image kind of around it?
yeah,
or-
I guess so. Like if you look back, you know what I'm talking about. It makes it look like it's more moving towards you while the car is kind of staying
Okay.
still.
So they're like giving it kind of a sense of speed, really.
yeah,
like,
exactly. Versus like top-down racing games had been or top-down was like the norm at that time.
Yeah.
And they also made a game called Zaxxon in
That I've heard
1982. Yeah, it's an arcade shoot 'em up, and that's the first ever game to use the isometric viewpoint.
There's some huge innovations already. in
Yeah,
this.
in the arcade industry, Sega was the number one forever. So Sega buys Gremlin, and they make a bunch of dumb name changes like Gremlin Sega, Sega Gremlin.
How do they?
Grega,
Isn't it like a hassle to change your company names? And they've done it like 20
a
times.
million
Like,
times, yeah.
like,
They eventually land on Sega Electronics, and then it's sold to Bally Midway a year later.
so
at
wait,
the
is
time-
Bally Midway any relation to Midway or am I?
Yeah.
Yes.
Really? Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
it is the Midway, but at this point, they're like still making like they're just a manufacturer. Like they'll make like tables if you ask them to. Like,
My
Right.
question: Bally's. Did the pinball people also make exercise machines?
probably. I
Maybe.
mean, dude, there's so much of that shit in the '70s where like. And even up into the 80s, where like people weren't really specific. Like you could just be like,
Yeah.
"Yeah, we make pianos
Well,
and,
totally. So,
and LSD."
Not to go off on a weird but I've been watching like weird YouTube documentaries about gaming from the like a little past this era, but around this time. it was the Wild West for like electronic companies. They would pair off and do weird partnerships all the time. Like Sega would be like, I don't know, like what if we team up with this company that makes CD players and then we make a portable Genesis with the screen on it maybe. Or and Sony and like Nintendo will be like, what if we teamed up with this TV manufacturer and then instead of a VCR on your TV, it's an NES. Like and then they'll make like 500 of them and be like, and then have another weird partnership a year later. They're like, I don't know, what if this game ran on satellites? You're like, what? Like it's so weird. Yeah. Like Sega made like 1,000 iterations of all their products.
Oh yeah,
like,
this is another thing that's amazing at this time. Like I forget how like they're literally like it's 50 versions of every console. Like you think the Xbox One X, Xbox One X,
you think
is
that's
bad
the
now.
DS and stuff is
like,
confusing.
It was way worse back then.
Yeah.
So yeah, that is the same Bally Midway, but they're not even close to being of the Midway that they become.
We would later know.
But a year later, they're.
But you're totally right though. Like from this era, there was a lot of like we make pinball machines and lounge chairs and you know weather vanes.
So a year later, they're shut down during the video game crash. Which we have to definitely do an episode
we've
about
referenced it a lot, but we will definitely do one.
So they were shut down completely. The Gulf Western didn't own them. Bally Midway bought them, like I said. They were shut down. So David Rosen, a guy named Hayo Nakayama from a company called Esco Buiki or Buki. It's some company that Sega bought in the 70s. And Isao Okawa, who's the chairman of another Japanese business service conglomerate called CSK. They're just another one of those big like holding
groups.
Versions,
okay, yeah.
The three of them purchased Sega Enterprises in Japan back from Gulf Western. So now Sega is headquartered in Japan for the first time in like a decade, and that's kind of where its headquarters stays, even to this day. Even though there is Sega of America or Sega Soft eventually and all that stuff, but...
Well, that's the interesting thing about this story is like when you were talking to me about this, it's like in many people's minds, and myself included, it's just you think of Sega being a like strictly Japanese company.
Oh yeah,
like
absolutely.
You think that was just kind of always what they represented.
This is also a thing in Japan where a lot of companies will just like have their fingers in everything. Like a lot of companies are holding companies. A lot of people don't know Sega's still a holdings company.
Yeah, it's called, what is it?
Sega Sammy.
Sega Sammy, like
because
holding group or
they
holding
merged with another company called Sammy that made pachinko machines.
Of course.
But like, you're like, oh man, well, fucking Mitsubishi is like, they make terrible cars. They're shut down. They're gonna stop making cars. It's like they also make orange juice and own a bunch of like.
Well, isn't that like
clubs.
Konami as well?
Yeah, Konami owns like health clubs in Japan.
Yeah,
and,
They were talking about the one podcast. They were saying it was weird because they were recently in Japan and they were saying that like they also Konami has like a brand of, I guess, people that work in the like some sort of service industry for just like appliances. So they just saw like repair trucks with the big Konami logo like driving around. It's like, that's so weird.
Right. It's like McDonald's vacuums.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's just not the dystopia we wanted, but it's the dystopia we have.
That would be, imagine though, like that would be a fun world if all the companies we knew just made whatever the fuck they felt like it constantly.
All right. So in 1982, good year, Sega begins its adventure.
Year you were born.
Yeah, but it was almost 10 years later. So Sega begins its adventure into the world of video game consoles. Their first ever thing they do is a deal to exclusively distribute ColecoVision in Japan. And that
weird.
fails.
I didn't know that. Okay.
Well, that's why, because it never happened.
Oh, it never happened?
It
Okay.
immediately fails.
All right.
But that's okay, because
Coleco's
Sega's
still a
like,
company,
hey, we're
I
going to
think.
make our own console. And they do. On July 15th, they released their first console, video game and home consoles in the world, the SG-1000.
This is weird because, like, this console, like, you know how people refer to the NES as the Nintendo?
Yeah.
Like, this console, the way it looks and branded is, it's like that's the Sega.
Oh, yeah.
And it's weird because it's
it
like...
almost looks like an old tape player.
It definitely does.
So the only other thing that was released that day was the Nintendo Family Computer.
Wait, that was the same day?
Same day.
The
or
NES?
the NES.
Yeah, what?
Which, if you know anything about video games or anything
that's
about
rough.
culture, that's a rough first day. So Sega hit the ground running. The SG-1000 doesn't even come close.
Yeah.
The NES is the NES.
What was it priced at? Was it competitively? Like, do you know?
Yeah, they were pretty much priced around the same thing. It's all yen until it gets to America, and then at that point the prices are so convoluted.
I guess, I mean, the NG-1000 didn't have that, to reference our Halo episode, that killer app, like like the NES launched with recognizable games like Donkey Kong and stuff.
So despite the rocky start, Sega survives because they have a bunch of arcade clout.
There has to be a Tetris on that thing.
What's that?
No, nothing.
They have a bunch of arcade clout, so they actually managed to survive a little bit. And they also had a pretty successful release of one of their in-home computers called the SC3000 in Australia, which in Australia and New Zealand, they made a decent home computer that survived. And they also made the Robo Pitcher toy, which is literally one of those like pitching machine toys. It's just throws baseballs at you. So
Sega tried to incorporate some of that stuff into games too. They had like weird peripherals that like used real world stuff.
Oh, they are the king of peripherals.
I know, they're so dumb. They're like, what can you wear while playing a game, or how can we make you look stupid?
So they managed to get a decent foothold in the Japanese toy market and stay alive.
Enough to keep...
Enough to, in 1985, finally make a name for themselves. They released their third in-home system, because there's an SG 1002.
Oh, is there an iteration on it?
Yeah, it's an SG 1002. It's literally just like a slightly better, but not really kind of the version.
Sega also real big on iterations.
Their third in-home system, the Sega Master System. And in Japan and America, the Master System wasn't able to compete with Nintendo.
No.
Because the NES was still the biggest fucking thing on Earth.
Oh,
dude.
yeah.
Especially by
Everyone had
1985. Like, at this point, they had, 3 or 4 years to put out and invent Mario and Donkey Kong and all these freaking characters.
The SG-1000 wasn't in America?
It was later.
I think it did eventually.
Usually they stagger by 8 months to a year, pretty consistently.
You saw that a lot back then.
Because I never heard of that thing.
If it was absolutely shrouded by the NES.
You might recognize it by a picture because it's literally like this white-looking like 80s grill thing, and it just says Sega real big on it.
If you look,
see,
it looks like an old school tape deck.
Yeah, man, they made two versions. They made the SG 1002 and the Sega Mark III.
And the Mark III,
which was the third.
The Mark III was actually like a port of one of their arcade boards. Like they tried to bring some of their arcade board tech into it.
Oh shit! I don't know if these were ever released outside of Japan. Maybe they were. I don't know. It's hard to tell. This was a really weird era. People were really just trying to figure out what to do.
All right, so they didn't.
Sorry.
No, it's all right. In Japan and America, the Master System really didn't compete. And in Europe, even though they actually bankrupted one company and got 2 others to blacklist them, they still managed to be successful due to the fact that Nintendo wasn't successful in Europe. They bankrupted the company because there was a bunch of distribution issues where they're like, we'll help you, and they like put out a bunch of money to distribute ahead of time, and then like Sega didn't deliver and the company had to file bankruptcy. And they did it to 2 other companies who just were like, fuck Sega, never again. And
the Master System made it here pretty quickly. I don't think the SG-1000.
It was okay in Europe. NES was destroying in America and Japan. But for some reason, interesting tidbit.
This is weird.
The Master System saw most of its success in Brazil. There it was released in 1989, so it's 4 years after.
Was there a FIFA game on it?
It was incredibly, yes. It was incredibly popular. For what I could find, I found it on like some Portuguese website. I had to keep like Google translating to find this. From what I could find, it was the world's longest lived console ever. The Master System because of Brazil. A company called Tectoy, which is a Brazilian-based company, say that they were still producing them in some version or another in 2015.
What? I want one. Let's buy one.
In 2015, they were still making one. And apparently, the systems in Brazil were outselling the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and all those major consoles in Brazil. The Master System. We're talking like the black old 1985
they're gonna lose their minds when the Genesis comes out.
Really. But like, was there something that these things did that like we don't know about yet?
I don't know.
Turns out if you take it apart, you can like get free internet and cook meth on it.
It's just huge in Brazil.
So there's
2015.
There's an interesting, Drew Scanlon from Giant Bomb?
Of course. I met him.
The Cloth Map did a video on the gaming market in Brazil, and there's like this whole illegal market of people still making like 8-bit games there.
Yeah, that was a big thing in
like
that.
They're making like
Did they
8-bit
have
versions of Guitar Hero and
well,
shit.
they have like a ban that like how China had a ban on home consoles till like
they have a weird thing with importing stuff. There's like
costs a lot of
like
money.
an Xbox 360
Import
costs
the tech.
$400 here. I think it was like $2,000 in Brazil.
Holy
Yeah,
shit.
the import
So I
on
guess
tech
this
like
is
that.
something that they could manufacture locally cheap enough.
Well,
and not have
Tectoy
to
didn't
deal with-
actually. They manufactured it and built it and all. It was kind of almost like a reverse engineering. It wasn't like it wasn't like the actual thing. But
So
it was
like the
enough.
patents
Sega was
expire on those parts. Like
Well, no, Sega was okay with it because
Okay.
they were still making residuals from
Right.
all of it.
I guess there are a lot of Sega consoles. Like there are weird iterations of the Genesis and stuff like that, and the CD and Saturn that were like made by different companies.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It
And
happened
they
all
all
the time
look
in that time
aesthetically
period.
different
Yeah.
and like were sold at different
If
prices.
they could
It's-
get distributors to make them, this
Yeah.
is how it was in that time.
It's
They
just
weren't-
weird. You don't see that anymore. Imagine if there were like 20 different versions of the PS4 all made by different manufacturers.
It's because at this time a global supply chain wasn't a thing. Like you couldn't just like ship a fucking thing halfway across the earth in like a day.
and be
you
like,
know
put
what I
this
mean?
on the shelf.
Yeah.
Man.
So by 1987, they had 40,000 arcade cabinets worldwide. They were doing pretty good in the arcade industry, and they actually had knocked off the Titans Atari
Oh,
and became the
man.
second most popular in-home console in the world. Pretty much almost on the backs of Brazil and a little bit in Europe.
That's so funny. That's
Yeah.
so weird.
Like
Yeah.
and because the only other competition was the NES.
Yeah,
So
of course.
you didn't have a lot of options. It's not, you know. All right. So Sega's finally hitting their stride. On October 29th, 1988, they put out their next console, the Sega Mega Drive.
And Nintendo being the dicks of the
Yeah, it's released in Japan 1 week after Super Mario Brothers 3. So, as I say many times in this, the crowd goes miles in Japan.
Mario Brothers 3. That's my favorite one.
As I wrote, those piece of
Love
shit
it.
mobsters in Nintendo, they had all the developers in their back pockets with exclusive deals.
Yeah,
And the NES had a gigantic market share, and behind them was NEC's PC engine. So Sega really didn't have a lot of room to move in there.
Yeah, especially without all the like all the partnerships and stuff
Yeah.
with
Oh, Nintendo had everything down. And once again, Super Mario Bros. Just came out. This is a consistent theme that shows up throughout this entire story, is Sega puts out a pretty decent product that by all standards should be
Should
good.
be able to compete.
And then some other day that week, like, you know, the moon landing happens next door. You know what I mean? Like, they just can't fucking win. But actually, they didn't do all that bad because Capcom and Namco had a decent amount of arcade ports they put on the Mega Drive, so they stayed at third place in Japan behind PCs and NES.
Kudos on them and not having that third party stuff.
Granted, third place is like it's essentially last place at this time period. You know what I mean?
Wow.
There's really not that many people behind them.
Anyway, I guess we didn't get to the multimedia stage yet, where you had like the CDI and the 3DO and all that,
No, that's coming up
Amiga
shortly.
and all that crap. Yeah.
So the real success of the Mega Drive comes from North America. Here it was known as the Sega Genesis.
Yeah.
And that's what most people know it as. Like, I mean, unless if you like games, you'll know it's the Mega Drive, but the Genesis is the shit. I had a Genesis. Fucking things were awesome. I absolutely loved it.
So it's like the Famicom and the Super Famicom. I always, in my mind, pictured them being different things because they look so aesthetically different.
Yeah.
Like the Mega Drive does not look like the Genesis.
No.
Like the Genesis like totally looks like and it's also they designed the console with like a rounded top.
I know, I love that rounded
so
top,
It's like,
Once again, though, the Mega Drive looks cooler than the Genesis.
It
just
does.
like the Famicom.
Just like the
looks
Famicom
cooler.
does.
Oh,
Super
yeah. The
Famicom.
Japanese
That's
aesthetic is... The
Yeah.
80s Japanese tech is my favorite
rad.
aesthetic.
Yes, it's very
There's not to
cool.
get off, but there's a machine at my work that has like Robotech / Japanese 80s
Oh,
like
that's
tech
so
aesthetic,
good.
and I love it, dude. It looks so fucking
So
cool.
it's funny. I actually, growing up, and I know me and Austin have referenced this in previous episodes, but I never had a Genesis. I was the Super Nintendo kid, and then I was friends with a neighbor that had a Genesis, so we just went over each other's houses.
Yeah.
She had the Genesis, I had the Super Nintendo, and we would just like exchange, like back and forth. Like
That's
sometimes
awesome.
we would borrow each other's consoles and
Yeah.
stuff.
See, that's fucking awesome.
Yeah, and I did like the Genesis, despite the fact that like I know like we've probably dogged on it just because it's not the Super Nintendo.
I make
but
jokes a lot about how growing up I never had any Nintendo products because the Nintendo 64 was my first Nintendo product.
that's so crazy to me. But
I had a Genesis, and I had a Genesis for a long time. And as much as I missed a lot of really good games on Nintendo consoles because I didn't know any neighbors that had
Yeah.
Nintendos, the the Genesis fucking ruled.
It did. It absolutely ruled.
And it's funny, I didn't get into the playground fights with Sega versus Nintendo. It wasn't until
because the playground fights were happening at the top of the corporate structure.
Well, that too, but I mean, like, I know, like, back, there was this kind of idea that back then, like, you were a Genesis kid or a Super Nintendo kid, but that competitive nature didn't,
I think we were too young
maybe.
at the time.
Yeah, you don't think that way when you're
Yeah,
like,
I mean, it came out in '88, so, like, by the time, like, we were all playing it, we were, you know, probably 5, 6, 7 kind of era, so... I mean, it had already been a little bit older at that point.
The other thing too is like I guess maybe you saw that more around like PS1 and N64 and then PS2, GameCube, Xbox. But
all right, so the Genesis actually wasn't distributed by Sega of America because Sega of America kind of just started and they were pretty inexperienced. So another inexperienced company took the reins on that. Tonka.
Like the trucks.
Yes, like the actual truck company. The people who made trucks distributed the Genesis in America. Fuck? They had a huge market share, Nintendo had a huge market share, so Sega thought, like, fuck it, Tonka's a huge American toy company. They'll have decent luck distributing it because, you know, they have a ground over here in America.
Yeah,
well, they were wrong.
Well, never mind.
Tonka did not do a good job. So they looked elsewhere. David Rosen, who was still Sega's co-president at this time, guy who originally helped bring it all together, he met with the CEO of the Atari Corporation, Jack Tramiel. I keep reading it as Tamriel when I was like going back over it. And the president of Atari Entertainment Electronic Division, Michael Katz. They tried to strike a deal in 1989. Tramiel denied the deal because the pricing on the system. The only thing to come out of the deal is that Michael Katz, who would be hired as the CEO of Sega of America and eventually oversee the release of the Genesis later that year, Katz put forth a two-part plan.
That wasn't priced that, like, you know. Like...
that's also a consistent problem, is that they keep saying that Americans won't buy expensive tech, and they keep wanting to lower the price and lower the price and lower the price.
Right.
So his two-part plan. One was to market the Genesis as an in-home arcade experience.
Yeah.
And attack Nintendo with 6 slogans I found, like, Genesis does what Nintendo don't. Yeah, they were really fucking winners back then.
I think I made a joke about that.
The extreme era. I think it was the ESRB one when we were talking about that fight. Yeah. It's pretty good because they marketed their stuff as being the family kind of thing, even though it's not true. They still publish plenty of, like, or not publish, but you know what I mean? They still allow in the
as you find out later, Sega
games,
constantly tries to find a marketing edge, sometimes even being like, we're the edgy system.
Yeah, exactly.
Which comes into play later.
They were such assholes. But they would totally be like, we're going to go after the older market. Like, because the arcades also at this time were more popular with people our age.
Yeah.
Like, they were popular hangout and drinking, smoking spots than little kids.
All right, so... Part 2. Nintendo owned most of the rights to the arcade titles, so they needed to develop games with recognizable likenesses, like Arnold Palmer Golf Tournament, Joe Montana Football, and from the Star of Leaving Neverland, Michael Jackson's Moonwalker.
Do you remember that game you're saving little kids from, like... Don't you put them in your car and take them to the mansion at the end and there's like a party? I don't know.
I think that was a nightmare you had.
No, I'm literally think that game, like Michael Jackson's Moonwalker, it's like the Smooth Criminal music video, but you're saving children.
I don't know. I remember they had a button where you could like
collecting
crotch thrust and go, hee.
Yeah.
They did.
All right, so at the time, everyone's favorite EA approached Sega, and they assumed since Sega had no third-party support that they would get a decent deal. They were like, hey, we have games, including, you know, at the time, the, you know, upcoming football game that they eventually get known for later.
John Madden's
Sega had no
football.
partners, but Sega wanted to be Nintendo. They wanted exclusive deals. They wanted exclusive deals with all their developers because they saw what Nintendo did with that.
So, like, hey, for our platform only, like, we want...
Exactly. So they told EA... CCO Bing Gordon, great name, that they were going to be as big as Nintendo, so they're not backing down on this deal. And after a year of back and forth talks, Sega executive apparently told Bing Gordon, quote, if you want a different deal, you're going to have to reverse engineer the system, aren't you? So, through an incredibly convoluted legal and technical process, because they had to go through a bunch of weird like patent shit and all that stuff, 2 very talented engineers at EA reverse engineered the Genesis.
Fucking A, jeez.
And now they had time for their play. This is so fucked up, but it's classic EA, and it's also kind of badass, to be honest, at the time. So at CES 1990, EA booked a booth the night before. Okay, the event, and EA Trip Hawkins, who he was an engineer. He didn't work on the reverse engineering, but he was a pretty big engineer. Like,
okay,
he was kind of one of those guys who's in a role of like engineer leadership kind of thing, like tech expertise, but he's kind of like liaison between like the heads.
I've definitely heard that name before.
I have too.
He met with Hayao Nakayama, who was Sega's president from earlier, and he delivered the news of the reverse engineering. He said they'd run their own licensing program if Sega didn't agree to their terms. So, yeah. So Sega was caught in an awkward spot, and they reluctantly had to agree. EA could manufacture their own cartridges because of this. If you remember, they had yellow bands.
Yes.
on
Right.
them.
Yeah.
So they got the rights to manufacture their own cartridge, make as many games as they wanted, and they had higher royalty rates than anybody else in developing it. And then CES the next day, there was a full display of EA games running on the Genesis.
Holy
So
shit.
actually, I read an interview. According to the engineers and Gordon, they actually hadn't fully reverse engineered the Genesis.
Oh.
They thought they did. Sega could still lock them out before, but it was too late. Like they had the confidence, so Sega caved and they got the deal. And then EA's first two titles were released.
This was fucking crazy.
Genesis.
I didn't know this.
Yeah.
And we covered this game on a previous episode.
Peter Molyneux's Populous, which we talked about.
Yeah,
I had to look it up because I was like, "Am I in the right thing?" Like I didn't know this. Like,
which I guess was a port of the PC version. Okay, yeah.
yeah, I had to
Weird.
look it up. I was like, "Whoa, I thought that."
Yeah, like, we
very
talked about
strange,
this. What the yeah.
And Budokan, the
Budokan.
martial
Budokan.
spirit, which I didn't look into because I never heard of it, so I figured it was dumb.
Is it a fighting game?
It's probably a fighting
It sounds
game.
like a fighting game.
If
I'm on
anything
it.
rules the 80s, it's fighting games and racing games.
That's
They,
true.
Like, set
and that
the
doesn't
pace.
sound like a racing game.
No, it doesn't.
Austin's gonna find out that it's like a matchup 3 game or something.
What was it called? The Martial Spirit. What a
Yeah.
dumb name.
Budokan, the martial spirit.
Mojang.
Yeah, it's a fighting
Child.
game.
Is it a fighting game? Okay.
So-
is it sprites? Is it photos of people?
It's sprites.
Okay.
So both companies continued to benefit from the deal, and yeah, it is kind of a shitty backroom kind of last minute
Little, yeah.
gamble slash in like.
Hold on, real quick.
No, go ahead.
This is a very short Wikipedia entry for Budokan, the martial spirit.
Okay.
The only thing I found: reception in December 1991 edition of Game Pro magazine. Budokan is cited as one of the worst games of 1991.
Well, there you go.
Yeah. It's solved.
All right, well,
Mystery
both
solved.
companies continue to benefit. They did even more around the holiday when John Madden's football came out at the end of 1990.
Yeah.
This is the first Madden, and if there's any consolation,
I think
like-
it's the only one that he has ever like actually been a part of the production of
Yeah.
or something. You ever see the box art, by the way?
Oh,
It's
yeah,
like a very
it's incredible.
confused looking John Madden on the
What's a
cover.
video game?
Yeah, like, it's really good.
That impacted sports gaming forever.
Oh yeah.
And the sports gaming, that popularity would set the stage for
That
the
meant
Genesis
the world. Yeah, like
in America.
your platform had the sports game. I mean, the Genesis was also known for having tons of great, like that's where the NHL and
FIFA,
Yeah.
NHL. Well, yeah.
You know
but
why I
that-
had a Genesis?
NHL,
NHL
94?
94,
94,
the best
yeah.
sports
That is-
game
Dude,
ever
absolutely.
made.
But that was the thing in America,
Yeah.
because all this success wasn't good enough for Japan.
Yeah, well, I mean, Madden's not gonna sell in
Yeah.
Japan. Yeah.
The console sales didn't meet the numbers. Michael Katz was fired and replaced with Tom Kalinske.
Tom Kalinske.
Tom Kalinske, who came up in our, didn't he?
Which one?
Did Tom
yes.
Kalinske
In the
come up in the
ESRB?
FAB
Yeah,
one?
absolutely.
Yeah. Well,
okay.
because I mean, it ties in pretty spectacularly.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Tom Kalinski's also a great character, and we'll see
Yeah.
as it goes forward. Kalinske had a 4-point plan.
Well, that's two more than the last guy.
I literally wrote that joke in. That's 2 more than cats. He was a believer in what they called the razor and blades business plan. Yeah, I had to look it up. So it means you sell one product at a low cost or
Yeah.
almost give it away for free,
yeah.
and you rely on the extra things that go with it to increase the sales.
I
Like,
think that's
you
isn't
have
that what like a lot of
complementary
movie
products, yeah.
production companies do?
A lot of
think-
consoles do this period. They
Yeah.
rely on hardware, especially in this time.
Yeah.
Software is where they made the
Oh
money.
yeah.
and
That's
not
like I know,
hardware
like
ever,
they're like,
yeah.
hey, like we'll take this at a loss, but we're gonna sell subscriptions and
Yeah,
like
exactly.
you know games.
Yeah.
And,
So the plan was this. expand the aggressive marketing, give some more Nintendo
Be
don'ts out
even
there.
more 90s than they already are.
Yeah, Genesis does what Nintendo don't do.
We put flames on all the consoles.
Develop more games for an American audience,
Yeah.
which meant more sports games and things like that.
Yeah.
Lower the cost of the console, and then replace the game currently being bundled with the Genesis, a title called Altered Beast.
Which is not a great game.
No.
It does have that pretty good vocal sample of Rise From Your Grave in the beginning.
Rise from your grave.
So they replace it with a new game. In 1991, Sega released that new game,
Oh, yeah.
whose main character was designed to be the Mario of Sega. Everyone's favorite, Blue. Randall, do you want to say it? I know you like, every time we bring him up, you say...
Sonic the Hedgehog?
Yeah.
Oh,
Sonic
yeah.
the Hedgehog.
Okay, side note. Polygon has a series of videos called Unraveled. And there's one called The Sonic Bible, where the guy got a hold of the
I live by the Sonic.
he got a hold of the document that Sega of Japan sent to Sega of America about what Sonic was supposed to be.
That's where they found out he was supposed to have a human girlfriend from the beginning and stuff like that.
They were like, hey, we need a Mario, literally, like that was the plan.
Yeah,
and they sent them this document, and the document's like, yeah, he's from like Nebraska, and he's on the track team, and Dr. Robotnik is a local scientist who's trying to end global warming or something.
God.
And then like,
I hope this all comes into play in that live action movie coming out this year.
Sonic the Hedgehog's dad falls into a toxic vat of acid and is burned alive. So then Sonic and his family have to subsist on trash, and then Sonic helps Dr. Robotnik.
This is a fever dream.
With his experiments, but then Dr. Robotnik creates the Chaos Emeralds to try to rid the world of chaos, but then it turns him into Eggman, and then he is Eggman, and then he gets turned into
point does
Dr.
Mean
Robotnik.
Bean Machine come in?
And Sonic's on the track team, and like all the old ladies use his spikes on his back to sew quilts for the local kids. Like, I swear to God, this is all true. It's fucking hilarious.
I take it back. I love
If you haven't
Sonic.
seen that video,
This is
watch it. It is
holy
phenomenal.
fuck.
Jesus Christ.
Oh man.
All right, so Sonic the Hedgehog usurps Alex Kidd.
Yeah, Alex Kidd,
who
right
was
in the dumpster.
Who was supposedly the original Mario replacement mascot.
Yeah.
And he also usurped most disappointing live-action adaptation of a blue character, which was Will Smith's Genie is the other one. So, the Genesis, it blew the fuck up in America. It outsold the Super Nintendo 2-1.
Yeah.
That's insane.
More
to
like
think
the
about.
stupid Nintendo,
Dude,
right?
yeah. Oh my
Alright.
God.
Stupid Nintendo Entertainment System.
In America,
In
we're
America.
idiots.
No, in Japan, obviously.
Listen, I
the
went
SNES
I think worldwide they ended up being extremely close to each other. I don't.
Oh, yeah.
I don't even remember.
I went back and played Mortal Kombat and NHL 94 on this.
Yeah, they're
SNES.
still great.
No, they're
Oh
garbage.
no! I
Yeah.
thought you were going to say the Genesis.
Yeah.
No.
So
On the
the Genesis,
they're trash.
Like
It's a
we talked
trash
about
console.
earlier, the Genesis was considered an edgy system among
Yeah,
kids.
I was an edgy kid.
kids who like putting in the Mortal Kombat
Whatever.
blood code.
Yeah.
Also, this is bullshit.
Yeah,
Because
those
my
versions
Genesis came with a copy of NCAA football.
That does
Sonic.
suck. Yeah.
Yeah,
No.
that is rough.
I had
But
to
yeah,
buy
all
Sonic.
these this is all good plans from Tom Kalinske. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Lower the
they-
price,
they
get Sonic
Get
in there.
this
Like,
the third party support and
Yeah,
everything
it's
because
brilliant.
that's the thing. Like we do joke, but it's like the funny thing is it's like I think by and large there are probably much better games on the Super Nintendo, but all the games that released on both the consistently the Genesis version was usually better.
Oh, yeah.
It usually
Yeah.
sounded better and
It's like all.
sound tech is I didn't have time to like put in all this great engineering
That was a
knowledge,
huge,
but
like,
sound
push for that
design was
thing.
absolutely like, really sought after at Sega. Like they had
Yeah.
really good engineers and
hey, that console had a fucking headphone jack
Yeah.
and a volume slider on it.
all right, so all this showed the success. They sold over 40 million units worldwide. They competed with the
That's up
NES,
there.
the SNES, the Neo Geo, the Atari Jaguar, and the TurboGrafx
TurboGrafx
16.
16, yeah.
And a number of other in-home consoles and computers in one of the largest console wars of all time, which maybe one day we'll get into the console war. If
They were
there's
more
any
fun back then because you
sort
had
of
like
thing, yeah.
all these companies throwing their hats into the
Oh,
ring.
it was a Wild West, dude.
Yeah.
It really was, like you said earlier. So, this is one of my favorite little statistics I found. The Genesis had the highest software to hardware attach ratio of all time.
Is that still true?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
16 games
That's
per console
really
on average.
good. Yeah.
That's insane, dude. I mean, different nowadays. I have like 70 games for my Xbox. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But like,
I know, like a lot
this
of times,
is a time
like,
when there was 17 games. So you know,
because I mean that's the thing. Like you think about consoles that sold stupid amounts, like the DS and the Wii and stuff like that. But a lot of times they'll buy a Wii and play Wii Sports and never buy anything else. So they had really small attachment rates.
That's why I'm saying it still holds as the average.
Yeah, but then
number.
you hear about consoles like the Vita that didn't sell very well, but everybody who owns one is like a super passionate fan that buys like a bunch of games.
This is not a surprising revelation because of some of these titles I list off. Echo the Dolphin, Street Fighter.
The ending boss is scary.
Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat 2, Jurassic Park Lost
Jurassic
World.
Park,
when I saw the picture for when I was like scrolling through like Sega Genesis games, and I saw the picture for Jurassic Park Lost World, I was like, fuck! I was getting like a weird like memory flash.
Yeah.
Like it just fucked me up. Sonic 2, Earthworm Jim, NBA Jam. Like fuck, NBA Jam was so good.
Yeah. I played that on the SNES.
I didn't write down the NHL. I don't know why. I didn't even think about it. The NHL, Toe Jam and Earl, and FIFA. Then there was a number more.
Was Street Fighter more like Mortal Kombat was definitely like people prioritized the Genesis version, but was Street Fighter that competitive?
Street Fighter was only better on the Genesis for the simple reason that
but Turbo came out on both and everything.
I had Championship Edition of Street Fighter 2 on Genesis, and because I had the 6-button controller.
You're right. Yeah, that made that probably always the number one in the fighting game
I think
community.
For Street Fighter, the SNES version was better selling,
at the time.
And for Mortal Kombat, the Genesis version was better
Yeah,
selling.
because Mortal Kombat didn't have it was just sweat. Remember?
It was blue sweat.
There was no blood, so a lot of that's why they were like, "Hey, we got Mortal Kombat."
Speaking of which,
here,
almost grosser.
We had a birthday party yesterday, and there was a Mortal Kombat 2 arcade machine there, and I beat Randy twice. Just so that's on the record, public knowledge.
Nice. I beat you on 11 last night.
Yeah, she did.
So all that success was enough to keep the Super Nintendo at bay, at least for a little while. But Genesis risked being outpaced in technology. So there were whispers of a new console that were emerging as early as 1991.
Also, you didn't mention all those Disney games.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah, Aladdin and Lion King were better on the Genesis. Come at
They
me.
were.
the Sega was going to attempt to leapfrog the competition.
They're getting
This is
cocky
something
now.
they try 3 times. I don't get it, dude.
I know.
They
it's
try
so weird.
every time they try, they fail,
was
and
really
they keep going.
bad.
Okay. They're not going to try to leapfrog the competition yet because they're going to go all Sega and make a huge mistake. Many thought Sega was going to release a 3.5-inch floppy disk attachment for the Genesis.
Boy, would that have been something.
Ahead of the times.
Yeah, you got to see that thing. It's incredible. But while they were all about that project for a while, it was eventually scrapped for the real technology of the future.
But-
CD-ROM.
Oh shit! Because there was a lot of weird attachments for the Genesis. Because the console would be like this little, rounded box, and then eventually you could just
It's a
slap all
tower
this
of shit
Yes, and it'd just be
attached
like
to
this shit on top and another shit hooked onto the right, something on the back, and then and then eventually it looks like this big, almost like toy G.I. Joe army base.
Absolutely. Dude.
Yeah, it
You
was
got
really
the floppy
funny.
disk attachment looks brilliant. It looks like a smokestack tower hanging off the side.
Hold
of
on. I got it. Can you see this, Randy?
You know what?
it. Yeah.
That's the
Wow.
floppy drive.
I'm thinking of the modem they had.
Oh, they did
Yeah.
have a modem, yeah.
Yeah.
They had like a service that ran for a little while where you could rent games and stuff through it.
So, in December of
So
1991...
wait, tell us about these CDs.
Yeah. Well, in December of 1991, Sega releases the Sega Mega CD in Japan. And it sold well early, but within the first few months, the sales dropped dramatically.
Yeah, that thing was...
The price was far too high, and there was far too little software to support it.
In the end, there wasn't a lot of games that did.
No.
There was a pretty low, a lot of them launched out at once, and then they
Well, yeah, you're talking about the new technology.
Yeah.
PC was struggling to catch up with programming
Yeah,
for discs at this
totally.
time. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like most games were on cartridges.
Yeah.
You know? So Namco.
there were
and-
some arcade ports. I
Yeah,
think.
Namco was responsible for a lot of the arcade ports.
Yeah,
There's another company called Data East. I didn't find anything.
Yes.
Oh yeah,
They
yeah.
made Windjammers.
They did make Windjammers.
Yes.
So Data East contributed a bit, but ultimately it wasn't enough in Japan. And across the Pacific, Sega of America, who had very little involvement with the development of the Sega CD.
Throw their hands up like, oh.
They decided to learn from Japan's mistakes, and they had a release date of October 92. They renamed the Sega Mega CD just the Sega CD. And Tom
rid of the
Kalinske had
Mega.
another plan. He put almost a third of the entire research and development for Sega of America to work on CD projects.
Jeez.
Because he didn't want the lack of software support that
Right,
Japan
that happened in
saw.
Japan.
They marketed a lot more, including having a kid play the game called Sewer Shark.
I remember that game.
on
But
good,
based off like the toys or whatever, the
I'm
show wasn't there a
assuming
cartoon?
so, or vice versa.
Yeah, I don't remember.
He played it on Good Morning America, and the footage was broadcast to the Jumbotron in Times Square.
Holy shit! Which I think they did that again with the Dreamcast. They may have, which is
Cartridge
like Good Morning
ports
America.
with better sound
Also,
and extra levels.
That thing probably looked like crap on like blown up on the Times
Yeah,
Square
I'm sure it did,
Jumbotron.
dude. They had cartridge ports onto the CD. A lot of this
Yeah.
went to Namco. It had better sound and better levels. Partly the better sound was because the Genesis developers were, like I said, really good.
They
at
had a
sound.
special sound.
They
chip,
made
right?
compilation discs where they had a bunch of like different games on one disc
Yeah,
for a
yeah,
price.
yeah.
They really
Demos.
pushed FMV games.
Dude, it's the
which-
few graphics aren't better than
yeah, the
fucking real
people.
life, dude.
Like most infamously, as we
Oh,
talked
yeah.
about in our ESRB episode, Night Trap was probably the most infamous
Vampire Slumber
FMV
Party.
game. And like you said, remember Tom Kalinske? You were saying he's involved. Well, he's involved with Night Trap and all the hearings.
Right,
at the
okay,
Supreme
that's-
Court,
that's how it-
and
that's
how
definitely how
all
it
ties
came in
If
there.
you want more information on that, listen to our
Whatever,
ESRB
there's a
and
three-parter.
amendment series.
Oh, yeah.
So it's a nice little 5-6 parters there.
Oh yeah, well I guess technically yeah, that is. that
So
was a venture.
once again, crowd goes wild.
What?
Enhanced discs were too pricey, so nobody wanted to spend extra money for ports on CD when they already
Yeah.
had cartridges for cheaper. FMV was a phase, surprised no one.
What?
And the
Me-
console itself was too pricey, $300, $299 price tag. And now there was the 3DO and the CDI and the
All
Atari
that
Jaguar CD
fucking
and the Neo
trash.
Geo CD and the
Yeah.
PC was coming up when adopting CD tech.
Yeah.
Sega didn't have any sort of advantage.
CDs.
So they decided that leapfrogging plan they were putting into play earlier before the CD, they wanted to get back into that. And I think that's where we'll
Yeah.
drop it on
in this
episode.
4-point plan.
Next episode, we'll get back to
Cool.
what they decide to do.
Yeah, this is like the race is on in this. But I don't know if you want to toss up some plugs, and then we're gonna part 2 will be up next week, and when we are gonna get into
We'll get back into
Yeah.
what they do next. It's surprise spoilers.
no all
Ant-Man goes into Thanos' ass and explodes. See you later, guys.
no, they nailed it. Their next console was a hit, and
Don't no spoilers.
Yeah, no spoilers.
with the Sega PlayStation and the Sega Switch.
All right. So thanks for listening. If you want to hear more, check us out on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, all that crap. Subscribe, review us on iTunes. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Hot Button Cast. We have a website, hotbuttoncast.com. Go there for all your hot button needs. There's a lot of good Photoshop pictures that I make. They're all on there.
Yes.
And yeah, we will be back next week with the continuing saga of Sega's lengthy history of failures with one success.
In-home console bumbles.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks.